So in the previous extended essay session, we went over the requirements of the extended essay in general, the do's and don'ts, and how to write a good research question, and also how you can take notes while reading research papers. In this video, I will go over the next phase of planning and actually going into writing your essay. And before we move into that, I want you to make sure that you have completed reading a majority of your papers and made notes on how you could use the findings of that research to respond to the question that you have chosen for yourself. The main sections of the extended essay or any other essay involve an introduction, a body or analysis of evidence, discussion, and a conclusion. You are likely to have more subheadings beyond these, which will be based on labeling your primary argument and also all the counter arguments that you are planning. So first, the introduction. In this section, you will outline the background, theoretical framework, and your essay plan. This section is highly significant in setting the tone for the rest of your essay and also relates most to Criterion A, which is of focus and method. As for the introduction itself, I would divide it to about 4 to 6 paragraphs and limit it to about 600 to 700 words maximum. The very first paragraph is your best attempt to capture the reader's attention. Yes, examiners have no choice but to read your paper, but think of them as someone who has the choice to put your EE away. So what can you do to keep them reading? Remember the importance of the primacy effect and also first impressions. Using statistics, quotes, facts, and potential controversies or debates in the first paragraph are a few ways that you can grab the reader's attention. In the next 1 or 2 paragraphs, you can give background into the area of research and describe a classical research that may have been conducted in that area. It is also a good idea to discuss the importance or the relevance of the investigation in the current day and age, and how this research would contribute to that. One thing to not do in this section is give a lengthy historical account or timeline of everything in that area thus far. This will probably result in the loss of focus and consequently the loss of points. Once you've set the context of your investigation, define the main terms or set of variables that you are going to require to understand the rest of your paper. So it is the essential definitions that a reader might need in order to be able to understand all of your discussions. Make sure you use a definition from a published paper or a credible website and not just something you've come up with on your own based on your understanding. This will contribute to your effective use of terminology and will reflect on your Criterion B. Consistency, again, is very key. The research you use needs to be in line with the definition or operationalization that you have done in your introduction. If for your investigation, as in the example that I'm going to use for this video, you are investigating the effectiveness of EMDR therapy in treating trauma. If you define trauma as a result of physical, psychological, or sexual abuse during childhood, you need to use research in line with that operationalization. If you use research on trauma caused by road accidents or sports injury, this would affect your essay and likely your grades in Criterion B, A, and C. So make sure the research you use is consistent with the definition you provide. And some terms or variables or even phenomena have multiple operationalizations or definitions. And this can be a point of argument in your extended essay. In such a case, make sure that you mention the definitions, preferably just 2, that you will be exploring in this essay. Finally, in your introduction, you will outline your research plan. This involves stating your research question as is in your introduction, and you have to do it explicitly. That is a requirement for the introduction, followed by an outline of your methodology and the plan, and finally, a thesis statement. You lose points in Criterion A if you do not state your research question explicitly in your introduction. So please make sure that you do that. A good idea is to add your research question either bold or italics so it is not missed out by the examiner. And also to ensure that there are no other questions that you have stated in your introduction so there's no confusion as to what is your research question. A thesis statement, as I mentioned before, you need to state a thesis statement. This is basically your hypotheses or your essay's stance based on the research that you've chosen. And you will be making a conclusion before you act, like it's basically making a conclusion before you have started the discussion. Okay, so if you are going to say, I mean, a lot of questions are commonly based on to what extent. So in your thesis statement, you will state to what extent A has an effect on B, right? So to a certain extent, EMDR therapy is effective in treating trauma. So you will state that in your introduction and again, restate it in your conclusion. I've written out an example of a research plan on the topic of EMDR therapy on its effectiveness in treating childhood trauma caused by abuse. EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, is a procedure wherein a client is asked to think of a traumatic memory or anxious thought while tracing the back and forth movement as induced by the therapist. So basically, the rapid eye movement has been said to have a positive effect in treating trauma and also other disorders such as anxiety in clients. Okay, so this therapy has had a fairly controversial history with regards to its effectiveness. A lot of them consider it the miracle therapy, and others believe that this is just a hoax, or I wouldn't say a hoax, but it is something that isn't as effective as we make it out to be. Okay, so here's my research plan. It's just an example, not based entirely on findings, as you can see the researchers' names. So I'm just going to read it out for you. This essay will examine the question, to what extent is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy effective in treating childhood trauma? So I have changed the color. You can just bold or italics your question. For the purpose of this investigation, peer-reviewed research articles will be analyzed. The inclusion criteria is research conducted on individuals experiencing trauma as a result of psychological, physical, and/or sexual abuse during childhood, and papers that were published after 2005. So that is my inclusion criteria. This is how I am choosing which researchers that I want in my analysis or in my paper. The exclusion criteria are researches conducted on individuals undergoing EMDR therapy for trauma caused by accidents. So a road accident or a sports related injury that caused trauma, I am not including that in my paper. So this is my methodology, okay? Just a brief outline of my methodology. Research, again, here, the next paragraph, I'm summarizing all of the researches that I'm using in my body before I have even actually explored that, okay? So this is what you will be expected to do in your introduction as well. Research conducted by Huang, Kongsepezel, and Young argue that EMDR therapy is effective as it allows for synchronization of the two hemispheres, relaxation, and mimics REM sleep eye movement, respectively. On the contrary, Fan argues that EMDR therapy is only effective when compared to no intervention, and that effectiveness may be attributed to the therapeutic alliance and other therapeutic processes. Parinya Srisawat further argues that effectiveness of EMDR therapy is affected when administered in isolation, as compared to when it is administered along with CBT. Finally, Kormaker's research suggests that although EMDR therapy reduces immediate symptoms of trauma, there are high relapse rates, especially with the experience of trauma flashbacks. This essay concludes that EMDR therapy is effective only to a certain extent when administered as a standalone technique. So I have outlined all the researches that I will be using. This would typically be about 10 for you. Okay, here I have, I think, about 6. But that's okay. So you'll be outlining like the main points that a group of researchers are making and the counter arguments that you will be making right in the introduction. And then you will finally end your introduction with a thesis statement like this one. I have stated this essay concludes. I'm telling the reader the conclusion right at the beginning of the essay. This essay concludes that EMDR therapy is effective only to a certain extent when administered as a standalone technique. So the rest of my extended essay is going to focus on arguing this point, right? As mentioned earlier, Criterion A, which focuses on focus and methodology, is mostly assessed referring to your introduction. The rest of your essay is also considered in a holistic approach when grading this criterion. The first strand is that the topic is communicated accurately and effectively, and the high range descriptor for the strand is that the candidate identifies and explains the research topic effectively and explains the focus of the essay and the purpose, which is basically the relevance of your topic. The second strand is graded based on your research question. We have gone over what makes a good research question. It has to be specific, right? And typically has to have only a set or a pair of variables that it's exploring and not multiple variables because that makes it too broad. Finally, your methodology is complete. This looks at whether you have chosen researches that are relevant to your question and also whether you have utilized the research or not. Citing a list of researches and not actually using it and referring it back to your question is not acceptable. And in fact, that can be flagged, your whole EE can be flagged for academic misconduct if you do that. And that would obviously then mean that you do not get your whole IB diploma. So it is very important for you to use the resources and the researches and not just make a whole list of references and citations in your essay. Okay, a rule to follow is if you haven't cited the research in your essay, in the body of your essay, in the 4,000 words, it is better or it is something that you shouldn't include in your references at all. Okay, if you have used an article or a book for primary reading and haven't really included it in your 4,000 words, that is okay, but make sure that you mention that it was primary reading, okay, in your reference list. So moving forward, a major part of your extended essay is analyzing research to argue your thesis statement. It is advisable to allocate a majority of your word count, about 2,500 to 2,600 words, to this major section. Okay? Use your thesis statement to structure this section. Start with researches supporting the primary argument. In this case, or in my case, that EMDR is effective. Then you will use counter arguments to follow or provide different perspectives to the idea that EMDR is effective. Okay, and I would have a maximum of 2 to 3 arguments. It is better to fully develop 2 to 3 arguments than just state multiple counter arguments and not develop it in relation to your question. So if you have like 5 arguments and I mean, within 4,000 words, it is difficult to completely develop 5 counter arguments. So I would choose 2 to 3 good counter arguments for your research, okay, or your question, and develop that thoroughly. Each research that you use in this section needs to be described in terms of aim, methodology, and findings, the usual grind. Do not include details that are not relevant to the development of your essay. For example, describing where the sample is from and that there were only male participants. If this doesn't in any way affect the findings of your research or analysis of your question, do not include it. It's as simple as that. You have 4,000 words, keep it specific, don't beat around the bush. Okay, so do not include research details that are not relevant to your discussion or to your development of your argument. Once you've described the research, you need to link it back to the question and evaluate the research. This is kind of like a mini conclusion after each research. Okay, so is it supporting my thesis, or is it challenging my thesis, and how is it doing so? Okay, so are the findings in support of the thesis statement, or is it in contradiction to the thesis statement? So you will make one statement of link back to the question or back to the thesis statement. Okay. If ethics, and as for your evaluation, only evaluate aspects of the research that are relevant. Again, there's only 4,000 words. Don't just do a methodological or formulative just evaluation using GMAC or GMECT and TCUP and include every single point, because that is not going to be relevant. Okay, a lot of the points might just be superficial. So make sure that you choose points of evaluation that are relevant to your question, to answering your question. Okay? And an example would be, if ethics doesn't really interfere the investigation of your chosen phenomenon or behavior or the body of research around that, do not evaluate ethics. Okay? But if it does, in the case of topics like interrogation or therapy, where a factor like confidentiality is regarded especially important, it is worth evaluating. Okay, does this ethical consideration that we do have to abide by and follow limit the scope of research? Okay, so that is how you're making the connection. If there is no connection, then do not evaluate it. Okay, because if you're just going to mention it and not develop it, there's no point, and that's just going to reflect ill on your ability to critically think, okay, and develop the essay. Another thing to keep in mind is, if there are points of evaluation that are repetitive in nature, do not include it after every research that you have mentioned, or after or during the evaluation of every research that you're doing. Okay? For example, all research in the area that you have chosen are correlational. So the drawbacks of that would be that there is bidirectional ambiguity, and there's the third variable issue, right? So what you do not do is include the same point of evaluation after each research that you have discussed, okay? Because that's just going to be repetitive, and it shows that you do not have points beyond that. You cannot critically think beyond that point, okay? So if there is a common limitation or common strength or common pattern that you're seeing in the researches, make sure that you take it to your discussion, and maybe you can note it down in your notes for the time being, okay? So again, do not repeat yourself. It is a common issue, take it to the discussion. Once you've explored all the researches you've chosen for your essay, you will write a discussion and conclusion. This is a very important section to tie together the findings of all the researches that you have included in your body of the essay, and how they relate to your thesis question, thesis statement, and research question. Okay, so in your discussion, you will discuss the main patterns or findings, and also the common limitations or even strengths, like I just mentioned. You can extend this to issues of predictive validity, construct validity, biases, difficulty in operationalization and measuring of the variables, any areas of uncertainties, and so on. Okay, so don't keep it very basic and say, oh, yeah, bidirectional ambiguity. But what does that have to say about the research, and how is it limiting the findings and its applicability, or is it biased? So extend your critical analysis to greater discussions, okay? And you can also link it to an issue beyond psychology. right? Yes, it's still linked to your topic, but it can be related to something beyond that. For example, digital divide. For research, or if you have a topic that is researching technology and its impact on various behaviors and cognitions, most these researches are conducted on people who have access to technology, and people who then go ahead are people who are young, affluent, know how to use technology, are educated, are university students. So the sample itself is biased, right? So then how does that have an implication on the findings? And would you have the same findings were you to conduct the effect of technology on another group of people, okay, who are not affluent, and so on. Okay, so these are again points that you can extend your evaluation and discussion to. So you can discuss future implications as well based on your research, providing suggestions on what more needs to be investigated in this field to better understand the phenomenon or the relationship between two variables, and also how you can reduce the compromise for current limitations. So it could be methodological suggestions for the future, right? And your conclusion would be a statement of your findings, and again, an explicit statement of answering your question. Okay, so if it's a to what extent question, which is the most common question, you will have to state to a certain extent, to a large extent, and so on. Okay, and make again reference back to all the researches that you have utilized. So it's basically the same statement or the same paragraph that you have written in your introduction. Basically reword that and add the main findings that you have found from your research. Okay, so that will be the end of your essay. And as for the criterions that are relevant to the body and the conclusion and the discussion, criterion B is your knowledge and understanding, which is assessed based on your ability to explain the research you've described, and that has to be in relation to your question, and also the use of relevant terminology, okay, psychological terminology, research terminology, and you need to use it accurately, okay? A very common example of making mistakes or confusing two terminologies or two different concepts is reliability and validity. Okay, a lot of the times those are two concepts that are confused, and that definitely would affect your or the examiner's evaluation of your knowledge and understanding of psychology. Okay, at the end of the day, this is an extended essay you're doing in psychology, so you need to showcase that you understand psychology and research. Okay, and then there's Criterion C, okay, which is your critical thinking criterion that is worth a whole 12 points of your extended essay, okay? As I've covered, you need to evaluate consistently throughout your analysis or throughout your body paragraphs, okay? And also you need to holistically analyze or evaluate in your discussion. So there's two levels, at the individual level of the research and also at a more holistic, greater level, okay? That will look at the body of research, not individual, but body. So if you consistently evaluate but do not include a discussion in your extended essay, you will get no more than 6 out of 12 points. And that is if your individual evaluation is not repetitive and is thorough and just shows good critical thinking, then you could get maybe a 6 out of 12. And the same applies if you only did an evaluation right at the end in your discussion with no evaluation in the body of your essay. So there's no development that would actually affect several other criteria, okay? And this would also make your whole essay pretty descriptive and superficial, and that goes against the whole purpose of this project, which is for you to emphasize and showcase critical thinking, okay? So to finish off, here is again the tentative breakdown of the word count for each section. Like I said, analysis of research is a significant chunk of the paper, so I would allocate 2,400 to 2,500 words to it at least. I would allocate 600 to 700 words to the introduction, and 800 to 900 words on an average to the discussion and conclusion. So this is the run through of how you can structure your essay and write your essay. I highly recommend that you work on it over the summer break, as the working draft is due soon after we return from summer holidays, and also your workload in DP2 is going to increase by quite a lot. A good way to approach this whole project is to do little every day. Read one research paper and write notes in 2 days. So one research paper for 2 days. Or write 200 to 250 words a day of your essay, right? So if you look at it that way, in 2 weeks you could be done with the essay. But a lot of the times what we do is we view it as a 4,000 word research project where I have to read about 10, if not more, full research papers. And this is not the first time you guys are doing that. But yes, that is a huge task, with all of the terminology and how saturated research papers are. So it is a big task, but if you look at it as a whole, you are trying to climb a mountain in one go. Okay? So break it down and take it step by step and make sure that you are consistent. And if you maintain the consistency of working maybe 1 hour a day on your extended essay, you will probably have a working draft, as you need to have one by the end of summer. So yeah, that's my piece of advice for you. And I will be available to discuss if you have any questions and answer them for you. But you will have to just set a time beforehand if you want to talk about it. Okay?